What's up, guys? This is Taking the Field with Stevie Mac, and it has been too long. I'm so excited to be back doing this show again here, talking all things Premier Lacrosse with you guys this summer, and what a great time also to be able to get back into this as well here on the podcast with the PLL Collegiate Draft happening just last night over on ESPN. A couple things I want to get to with this episode. We'll talk PLL on ESPN starting this summer. I also want to get into Ben Rubeor, the GM, obviously the head coach of the Atlas, but I want to talk Ben Rubeor, the GM, after last night's draft. Some surprises within the draft as well, especially in the early going. So we'll talk about some surprises from the draft itself and then wrap it up as we did all last summer, getting your thoughts in the mix as well. But to start things out, like I said, talking the PLL on ESPN, that deal was announced about a few weeks ago now, if memory serves. And the draft was really last night our first look, in my opinion, at the PLL on ESPN, as now ESPN has college lacrosse, NLL and PLL now all across their platforms and networks. And there were some questions when this deal with ESPN was originally announced, as I mentioned about a few weeks ago now. There were some questions around lacrosse Twitter and around the lacrosse community about the production quality and really the overall investment that ESPN would make into the PLL and its on-field product, really. And I think that while NBC did a good job with the production and the product itself, I think ESPN is the way to go. It's more the long-term home, I think, that we will see for the PLL moving forward. And I also wondered too, watching that draft last night, this was something that I had mentioned, was did we get introduced possibly to the PLL broadcast booth during the draft for this summer in Chris Cotter, Ryan Boyle, and Paul Carcaterra hosting that draft last night. And I mean, all three did a fantastic job. I really thought they worked the conversation very well from start to finish and really bounced off each other well. And that's really something that, as a broadcaster myself, that's something that you want to see, is that ability to hold that conversation the way that they did and really bounce it off each other, as I mentioned. And I thought that, going back to that original point about the questions around the production and the investment by ESPN into covering the PLL and helping move it along from a media standpoint, the studio was absolutely amazing. I thought the layout was super cool, where the hosts could actually interact with the coaches from across the studio. And I thought one of the things that I really loved about the setup was the draft board on the big wall. That screen behind them in the studio was really cool as well, that updated in real time with each pick. I thought that was super cool to have there. And just being able to talk to players as well, like Chris Gray, that they had on after going second overall to the Atlas, being able to talk to some of those guys about being drafted and sort of what they can bring at the next level to the team that they were selected by. But one thing I would like to see in the future, and I'm sure I mentioned this on a show last summer as well, but one thing I'd like to see with the draft in future years, we might still be a couple years away from this, is can we get some of the players on site to walk on stage when they get selected, like they do in other sports, most notably in the NFL. When you talk about that first round, you see the guys walk up there, they put the hat on, they shake the commissioner's hands, things like that. You know, can we see something like that with the PLL in future drafts? Like I said, maybe a couple years from now, but you get a guy like Chris Gray, walks on stage, puts the Atlas hat on, shakes Paul Rabel's hand, Mike Rabel's hand, all that. And I think that's something that I would definitely like to see in the future, and I think a lot of lacrosse fans would like to see that in the future. So just, again, something to keep in mind as we move forward. But overall, I thought that the draft was very entertaining. I thought it was really well put together. The studio, again, was fantastic with everything that they had in terms of the layout and things like that. Again, that big draft board in the back was fantastic. And I really think that, like I said at the top of the show, there were a few surprises in the draft itself, but we'll get to that coming up next on Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. All right, welcome back. Taking the Field with Stevie Mack, segment 2. I want to talk about, as I mentioned, going into that first break, some of the surprises from the draft last night. There was more than a few, I would say, but I'll get into maybe 2 of the bigger ones from last night. But I also want to talk here in segment 2 about Ben Rubeor, the GM and head coach for the Atlas, and really the job he's done in his first couple drafts as sort of the quote-unquote GM of the Atlas, because I really think that after last night and the job that he did, he has really established himself as one of those elite sort of GMs in the PLL, because he was able to turn over a roster. And again, we talked a lot about this throughout last season and the job that he did and the way that the Atlas were able to play down the stretch of last season. But he turned over a roster with a lot of names on it, guys like Paul Rabel, Rob Pennell, Ryan Brown, just to name a few. And they got a lot younger. I don't know if I'd say a lot younger, but they got younger, and they really put together some really nice drafts these last 2 years now. And in his first 2 years, he's had multiple firsts last year in the college draft. He had multiple firsts this year, and those resulted in Jeff Teat, Doc Zakin, Chris Gray, and Kobe Smith. And those are 4, almost, I would say, all 4 day 1 starters for this Atlas team. So that's a really big thing to have when you have those 4 first round picks over 2 years, is that you have the ability to draft guys like Jeff Teat, like Chris Gray, that are sort of seen as the premier players in their respective draft classes, 2 of the top offensive players in their class as well. And obviously we know what Jeff Teat did last year, and anytime you can get the NCAA's all-time leading points guy in Chris Gray, obviously a good way to go as well. But that's not even including some of the entry draft picks that Ben Rubeor made a year ago, guys like Rexroad, Newbold, and Baccaro, just to name a few. But what we also got last night was the final results of that Paul Rabel trade to the Cannons last off season. And this is via Dan Arestia on Twitter. I saw this this morning. He said that the final results of that Rabel trade are that the Cannons got Paul Rabel for what was 1 year, because now obviously he is retired and working as the president of the league, and Zach Goodrich, and the Atlas wound up with Rexroad, Aiken, and Chris Gray. And I think that if you had to take a winner from that trade, obviously we don't always like getting into who necessarily won and lost a trade, or especially with an episode like this, who won or lost the draft itself. But I think if you had to say who won this trade, I definitely have to say that it was the Atlas, especially with the picks of guys like Aiken and Gray, because I do think Aiken will take a big step in his second year coming in this year. And Chris Gray, obviously, again, anytime you can get a player of his caliber, the NCAA's all-time leading offensive point producer, is just an absolutely great thing to have. And obviously, you look at what the Cannons got back in return. They essentially gave up that for 1 year of Paul Rabel, and yes, that was easily his best year in the PLL last summer. He was one of the top scoring middies in terms of point production last year, and really showed that even late in his career, he can still be one of the best at his position. And it's also not an indictment on Zach Goodrich either, who they also got essentially in that trade, because he's obviously a fantastic player as well. But again, I think anytime you can add the caliber of players that the Atlas were able to get out of it, especially with guys like Aiken and Chris Gray, that it's hard to kind of vote against that, really. And I think last night, you know, you look at some of the other picks that Ben Rubeor had, he goes with Gray, obviously, probably didn't think that he would fall into his lap at number 2. And I think that it's a really good problem to have when you're sitting there at number 2 and now you have your pick of whether you want Chris Gray or you want Matt Moore. And I think if I had to bet going into it, he just assumed, as we all did, that Gray was going to go number 1. So that means he got Matt Moore at number 2. And that's a hell of a consolation prize, if you ask me, getting Matt Moore. But obviously, like I said, Gray falls to it too. So in that case, you almost have to go with him. But I also want to believe that there was at least a little bit of thought there as far as maybe sticking with Matt Moore as the pick. Then he goes Smith at 5, which was a pick that I think needed to happen, get some depth at LSM, and why not take probably the top LSM in the draft in that spot. And then he goes even better and trades out of picks, I believe it was 11 and 24 in the draft, and gets a first round pick in 2023. So you talk about the drafts he's had, getting guys like Jeff Teat, like Doc Sakin, like Chris Gray, etc., etc., etc. Now he has, for the third year in a row, will have multiple first round picks in 2023. So he's had multiple first round picks in 21, 22, and now 23. So that is just an unreal job by Ben Rubeor to handle the draft the way that he's been able to do so far here with the Atlas. And I said it on the PLL Discord about a week ago on there that I really believed Ben Rubeor in some way was going to make an aggressive move with his picks. He went into the night with 6 picks in the draft, which was, I believe, the most of any team in the PLL last night. And I believe he was going to be aggressive one way or the other, either taking a couple picks and trading up to go get a guy and essentially ending his draft early, or trading out of some picks and going and getting a 2023 pick. And he ended up doing the latter, but I never really expected him to be able to take 11 and 24 and go get a first. I mean, I would have expected a second, and, you know, maybe if he did, let's say 21 and 24 for like a third next year. But the fact that he was able to get a first round pick in next year's draft, which by all accounts, even this early on, is supposed to be an absolutely loaded PLL draft next year, on top of getting Chris Gray and Kobe Smith last night, was just absolutely an unreal job by Ben Rubeor. And then you can't forget either, he got Curry out of Syracuse as well as sort of that dodging midfielder. So really, with those 3 picks, those first 3 picks that he actually used in last night's draft, he was able to hit on every single one of the Atlas's needs. He got that generational talent offensively to go with last year's generational offensive talent in Jeff Teat. He goes out, he gets that LSM depth at number 5, and then he gets that dodging sort of creative midfielder in Curry at, I believe that was number 13 he ended up going. So again, just a masterful job these last couple of years in the draft, especially the collegiate draft, by Ben Rubeor with his Atlas GM hat on. But I also did say I wanted to touch on a few of those sort of surprises from the draft last night as well. Probably one of the bigger ones was Nikai Montgomery, a projected first round pick in the PLL draft, fell all the way to number 19 overall in that third round. And like I said, he was projected to go in the first round. Some saw him going number 2, potentially to the Atlas at one point in time. Others had him going number 3 to the Redwoods. But you want to talk about a masterful job in the draft, like we just talked about with Ben Rubeor. How about Nat St. Laurent going out and getting Montgomery at pick number 19 and still ending up with a guy like Arden Cohen at number 3? I mean, that had to have been probably the absolute best case scenario for Nat St. Laurent and Redwoods fans coming out of that draft, is you essentially got the 2 players that you wanted the most, where you could have taken either one at number 3, and you ended up with both of them. And all it took to get Nikai was that third round pick. And then probably the curveball of the draft really was Logan Wisnauskas going number 1 overall in the draft, as he was projected at least from what I saw for the most part, projected to be a late first round pick. Of course, in that range of the Whip Snakes at number 7, because let's be honest, all they really know how to do is draft Maryland Terrapins. But again, not necessarily the worst thing in the world, as they've been compared to sort of the Alabama of lacrosse, where anytime you can go out and get an Alabama guy in the NFL draft, you know you're getting a solid player. Same thing here. Whenever you can go out and get a Terp, you know you're getting a solid player that can play at the next level. But he goes number 1 overall to the Chrome, and obviously that allowed Chris Gray to fall into Ben Rubeor's lap at number 2. And I think that Wisnauskas is obviously a fantastic player, definitely a first-round talent, don't get me wrong. And I also got to have the opportunity to call a game. It was Michigan against Maryland last season in Ann Arbor, and he had a great game from what I remember that day. So obviously, like I said, a great player, definitely knows how to fill it up from a scoring standpoint. But I don't really think anyone saw him going number 1 overall in the draft. But Sudan later comes back. He gets Brendan Nichtern at number 9 overall. And I think that took some of the surprise away from the Wisnauskas pick at number 1. You saw Ryan Boyle and Paul Carcaterra sitting there, and they're like, oh, okay, you know, this pick makes a little more sense, because now they go out, they get that sort of playmaking quarterback at attack to go with a guy like Jackson Morrill. So now I think you started to see sort of the bigger picture of that Wisnauskas pick at number 1. But again, surprising nonetheless, because I think the unanimous pick at number 1 going into it was Chris Gray. And how about Sean Quirk also, I think, as a sort of surprise from the draft last night, not having a first round pick now 3 years running in 21, 22, and now 23, as they made that trade with the Atlas last night. They got number 11 and 24. Atlas get their first round pick next year. So Quirk, not really a fan, I guess you could say, of first round picks here in these collegiate drafts, because now he'll be 3 years running without one in the PLL draft. But I do like, however, his second round picks that he was able to come away with Asher Nolting and Bubba Fairman. So I guess all things considered, didn't have necessarily a bad draft last night, but still kind of interesting that he's I guess so easily willing to part with some of those first round picks, as we've now seen. So coming up, final segment of Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. I want to get your thoughts in the mix, as we always like to do. I always love getting your guys' thoughts on all things Premier Lacrosse as we wrap things up here with the 2022 PLL draft from last night. Final segment coming up on Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. Welcome back. Final segment of the show here on Taking the Field with Stevie Mac, talking all things PLL draft from last night. Logan Wisnauskas, as we talked about in second segment, going number 1 overall to the Chrome. Chris Gray falling in the lap of Ben Rubeor at number 2 to the Atlas. Get some of your thoughts, in the mix here to round out the show about the draft last night from Brian on Twitter. You guys can hit me up at Stevie Mac Media is my Twitter handle to talk all things PLL here this summer. But from Brian on Twitter, he says, number 1, loved the production, though I wish they used the ESPN draft music when announcing the picks and over the highlights a la the NFL, NBA, WNBA drafts. Number 2, not a fan of winners and losers, especially in the PLL. Essentially, every pick can be seen as a steal or reach in a small league. So just to preface this, I went on Twitter again, at Stevie Mac Media is my Twitter handle, and asked for just some general thoughts from you guys about the draft, and also maybe some draft grades, some winners, losers from the draft last night. Probably should have worded it more to the side of giving draft grades, as you'll see as we go through some of these responses that you guys gave. But to get to Brian's points, yeah, I think it would have been cool had they done sort of that the music that you hear, especially probably the most notable one is the NFL little jingle that they do when each pick comes in, something like that. Obviously, they probably can't use the actual NFL music in that instance. They'd probably have to buy the rights to it, I'm assuming, in order to use it. But maybe in future drafts, kind of like how we talked about the players coming up and shaking hands with Paul Rabel and things like that after getting selected, something similar to this with the selection music, as Brian's saying, something we could see in future years drafts. I think that's definitely something to consider. And then as far as the winners and losers thing, yeah, I think he makes a good point that essentially every pick can be seen as a steal or a reach in a small league, in a small draft like this, just the 4 rounds and 32 overall picks selected. And I think he makes a good point because with only 32 guys being selected last night, you can go and look at who's in the player pool now from that draft last night. There's definitely guys out there that could have and maybe should have been taken within those 32 picks that didn't. So yeah, it's really interesting to look and say that it's hard to judge some of these picks and how good some of these teams did necessarily drafting because of the fact that 1 through 32, you're getting an absolute stud that can play at a high level at the professional level. Mark on Twitter, in response to that comment from Brian, said, "Great points. Pro lacrosse draft was on ESPN. Blows my mind. We'll look back on this day 20 years from now and laugh. It's got to start somewhere. The talent, my gosh, how do you criticize any pick?" And yeah, I think he's right. You will look back on this several years from now, maybe not going as far as 20 years, but maybe 5 or 10 years from now, look back on it and see that where the sport is then versus where it is now, and where the league itself is then versus where it is now. Really, last night, as I mentioned, top of the show, getting our first look at the PLL on ESPN for the very first time. We'll look back on it and say that's the night where it really all started. And especially a couple of years from now, when we see what this draft class turns into, being able to come back to that night and saying that's really where it all started. And yeah, like I said with Brian's comment about there's really a steal or reach at almost any pick that you can point out in a draft like this, kind of similar to what Mark said about how can you criticize any pick. Like I said before, 1 through 32, you're almost guaranteed to get a stud at whatever position you take, whether it be attack, midi, defense, face-off, whatever. I mean, these guys can surely play at the next level, and they're going to have, if they want to have, long professional careers. Coach Shrek says, number 1, production was great. Loved having analysts right next to the coaches for interactions and comments. And that's something we talked about that I noticed as well earlier on in this episode. He says, number 2, without a doubt, at Ben Rubeor PLL did the best drafting for the Atlas. Can't really say who did the worst, as every team filled the open areas they needed to fill. So yeah, like I said, probably should have worded that part of the question on Twitter a little bit differently. Maybe asked you guys for your draft grades rather than more so winners and losers from last night. But yeah, I mean, we talked about it there in segment 2. Ben Rubeor, if you had to say, probably did the best job of the coaches slash GMs in that situation, because you come away with a guy like Chris Gray, you come away with a Kobe Smith, a Brendan Curry, and you get that extra pick in the first round next year as well. So like I said, hard to doubt the work that he did last night. And then finally, Michael Ramirez said, Atlas getting Chris Gray and walking away with a first round pick for 2023 is insane. That wins them the draft, but really there's so much talent, not sure anyone lost. Having the draft on ESPN network is huge for the sport. Definitely need a pre-draft show in the future. Yeah, I definitely think sort of a theme here in this episode has been, now we saw what ESPN is capable of putting out in terms of a live PLL draft format for fans last night. Now, how can we build on that? What are some of these little things that we can start to add in over these next couple of years drafts? And, you know, I mentioned the one thing earlier was having guys like Chris Gray walk up on stage, put the Atlas hat on, all that. Brian mentioned earlier in this segment having the draft pick music and whatnot when the selections are made, similar to what the NFL and NBA do. And then Michael talks about having a pre-draft show kind of leading into the draft, talking about predicting who goes number one. As like I said earlier, I don't think many people would have predicted Logan Wisnauskas going number one, but having that pre-draft show that kind of leads into the draft itself, and then maybe even having a post-draft show where you kind of wrap everything up, give your final thoughts, and then send it out. But yeah, I definitely think those are some things that moving forward these next couple of years are things that we could and maybe should see coming from the draft on ESPN. But that'll do it for this episode of Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Again, so good to jump back on the podcast and talk all things Premier Lacrosse League with you guys here. More stuff coming in that regard as we move throughout the season, starting in early June and throughout the summer, similar to what we did last year. So good again to be back on the podcast. You can check out Taking the Field with Stevie Mack anywhere you get your podcasts, including Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify. The list goes on and on. iHeartRadio, just to name a few. But we'll talk to you guys later.